Good day, everyone. Let's continue with our section on the final account preparation and the final payment certificate. This is part 2 of our discussion. Now, let's go back to our steps that we identified. We've covered steps 1 to 3. Today, we're going to look at steps 4, 5, and 6. Step number 4 talks about the adjustment of preliminaries. Now, if we look at our final account summary page, you'll see there's a figure of R1,497 added to the contract. Can be a deduction as well. In our previous exercises and discussions, we've used a method which we referred to as the pro rata. In other words, what was originally allowed in the bill for preliminaries, and then base it on the final figure. So let's calculate the adjustment for preliminaries. And in this particular case, we will base it on what is given to us in the specific bills of quantity. Now, in the given contract, you'll note there was an amount of 40,000 Rand that was priced for preliminaries. And that breakdown was based on the 3 categories: an amount for fixed, time-related, and value-related. And we all know by now that if you look at the time-related, majority of your preliminary cost relates to time, construction period. So that's the makeup of the 40,000 Rand. So that was in the bill of quantities. We've now prepared the final account up to that point. Now we need to establish, do we need to add more preliminaries or do we need to deduct an amount for preliminaries? So we're going to compare apples with apples. We're going to compare the original with the final. So let's do that calculation. If we look at the original first of all, let's start with the contract sum. The contract sum, remember, that is now the amount less the VAT. So up till now, you'll note that we haven't touched on VAT. Nowhere in my calculations. It was all excluding VAT. So the contract sum excluding VAT. Then we omit the contingencies, because in that contract sum there was an amount of 50,000 Rand for contingencies, as well as the 40,000 Rand that was allowed for preliminaries. So we omit those 2 figures, which will give you then a new original amount of 1.354 million. So that's the original, compared with the final account. Now, where's that figure coming from? If you go to your final account summary page, just before the adjustment of P&Gs, that's the net contract sum before adjustment of preliminaries. There's no need to deduct the contingencies because in that amount we've already deducted the contingencies. Remember, we've created that contract instruction number 7, and if you go back to the contract instructions, there was only 6 given. We've created contract instruction number 7 because we have to omit it, so that contingencies omission has already been catered for in the 1.461 million. Nowhere in my calculation in the new contract value we've touched on the adjustment for preliminary, so take it out from that amount, and then we've got a final net figure there of 1.42 million. So that's the original, and that's the new. Good. So let's adjust the amounts related to fixed, time, and value. Now the fix is straightforward. What was allowed in the bill originally stay the same as the final. So there's no need to adjust any fixed category amounts. It remains the same. The value, what was allowed in the bill for value, an amount of 1,500. And this is now the value, the 1,500 was based on the original, then times it by the new will give me a new value, an amount for the value related items. In this case, slightly more than the 1,500, it adds up to 1,574 rand odd. So again, it's a pro rata calculation, the original 1,500 divided by 1.35 million, times it by the actual or the new value, which is calculated as 1.42 million. Time-related items. Now, in the bill originally, the contractor priced various preliminary items time-related to the value of 37. Now, this time is based on the contract period. Now, let's find out what was the original contract period and is there any changes to the contract period. If there's no changes, then it remains the same. So in this case, you'll note that there was an additional 7 days allowed for. So let us quickly recap on this calculation. Originally, 37,000 Rand was allowed. It was based on the original contract period times it by the new. So let's just quickly establish that. Where's the 182 coming from? The days times it by the new days, 189 days. So the tender date was on the 28th of October. The handing of site was on the 15th of November. So the actual contract periods start on the 15th. Obviously, no work will be done on the 15th, but that is day one. The actual handing over of the site is day one. Obviously, there's 30 days in November, so that leaves me with another 16 days, including the 15th. The contract period is to be completed. That was the original construction period, or the completion date was the 15th of May. So originally, the contract period was 182 days. However, there was extension granted of another 7 days. So the new extended date for completion was on the 26th of May, which gives me another 7 days. So the new contract period is 189 days, an additional 7 days. So let's go back to my time-related items. The 37,000 Rand was based on original 182 days. The new days for the extended period was 189. So that gives me then a new time-related value of 38,423 Rand odd. So if we added the fixed, the value items, the time-related items, that gives me then a preliminary cost of 41,497 Rand odd. We've priced for 40, so we still need to add on additional preliminaries of 1,497 Rand odd. So that is additional. It can be a negative figure, which we need to deduct. So if we go back to your summary page, you'll see my additional preliminaries that we need to add. And that brings me now to a new figure of 1.63 million. That includes, up till this point, it includes all the building work. So the building cost adds up to 1.463 million. Then we need to add the total amount for escalation. And this is now the final escalation. So if we go back to my steps, we've covered number 4, which is the calculation of the preliminaries. Step number 4 relates to the actual escalation. Determine the final escalation. Now you'll see we've got basically two subdivisions here. I've got the AF value, which is based on the practical completion certificate. And that's a straightforward calculation. And then once we've got the AF, we will then use the AF value to determine the final escalation. But there's a little bit of pre-calculations or pre-work that we need to do before we can calculate the final escalation. So let's go to the AF value, and that is relates to your certificate number 6, which was issued on the practical completion date. So you'll take your certificate number 6. The only difference is you almost duplicate that certificate, except that the previous totals adds up, or you insert a 0 amount for the previous total, and that you still apply the Haylett formula. The indices remains the same as per certificate number 6 on practical completion, and that will give you then the AF value. And note, you don't add, that is not escalation, that's the AF value. And we don't add anything or previous escalation to this value. It's a theoretical amount, that is the AF value. The same for your electrical installation, 0 amount previously, indices the same, and you'll note there's a negative figure for the AF value. Good. That now concludes the A part of step number 5, which is the AF value. Now let's look at the final escalation. Now the final escalation is a little bit of a extra work involved, because I need to establish what is the final value for each work group. So I'll have to go back to my spreadsheet, which I've started off in step number 1, and complete that spreadsheet. And once I've completed the spreadsheet, I will have the values, the final values for each work group. And then only I can do the final escalation. So let's go to my spreadsheet, step number 1, and we'll complete the spreadsheet. Now, if you look at the spreadsheet, you'll have to start from contract instruction number 1. Remember our step number 1, that was the breakdown of the bill of quantities. That was done at the step number 1. The final account is now divided into omissions and additions. So if we go to contract instruction number 1, which was the remeasurement of foundations. Now remember, in that contract instructions, you've got earthworks, you've got masonry, you've got concrete work, there was plaster and paint. There was a range of various work groups. So first, look at the omissions for contract instruction number 1. And there you'll see my reference there, contract instruction number 1. I'll add up all the earthworks items related to contract instruction number 1, and that adds up to 45,330. The same for the concrete under the omissions, contract instruction number 1. There was 147,000 Rand worth of masonry measured under the omissions for contract instruction number 1. And we can go along. There was plastering was 10,710 Rand. And also the paint work on external plaster on walls in the foundations was 9,135. So that's all the omissions. And then you go to the additions, and you'll do the same. You add up all the earthwork items for contract instruction number 1. You do the same for the concrete, contract instruction number 1. Masonry, you can follow that. There's the reference. So it means that you need to take every omission and addition for each contract instruction. You omit and you add. Right. If we look at the item regarding the prime cost, if I can maybe just alluded on that one. We omitted the prime cost for the ironmongery, and we add the ironmongery. Just take note of this figure in the bill. That figure was at 12,950, and if you look at that calculation, the side cost, we did have normal ironmongery measured in the bill, the 4,200, plus the prime cost items which was measured elsewhere. So if we add up those two figures, that will give you then the bill value for that one. Again, if we look at the preliminaries, in the bill there was 40,000 allowed for, and take note of this, there's no contract instruction for the adjustment for preliminaries. That was an addition. Remember our adjustment for preliminaries? That is the amount that we've calculated. We didn't, there was no deduction. It was a add-on. Contingencies. Remember now, whenever you had contingencies, that value at the end in the final account must always be 0 because you omit what was allowed for that. That was contract instruction number 7. If we look at the non-adjustables, because I'm going to have to work with this also in my final escalation. In the bill, there was 18,000 rand, and if you still remember, the profit and attendance on the electrical work was 9,000 plus 9,000. That adds up to 18,000. If you go to the contract instruction number 2, which is the adjustment for nominated subcontractors work, in this case electrical, we omit the 9,000 profit and attendance, add up to 18,000 rand, and we add the 20,813 for electrical work. But also note that the paint on the roof, there's an instruction that we need to paint the roof, and that paint on the roof was a current rate. It was almost seen as day works, priced at current rate. So when there's a current rate, it means there's no escalation, it's a work group 0. So if we add up the two amounts, you'll find that the 0 work group non-adjustables add up to 79,733. Those two figures. Right. So the purpose of this sheet is to calculate the final work group totals which we will use in the final escalation certificate for escalation. So the starting point is your bill, and then you'll take your final account, you first deduct all the emissions, and then you add all the additions applicable. So to get to that figure, you start with the bill, omit, add, will give you the final. For concrete, the bill figure, omit, add, will give you the final total for concrete work. So this is very important, this spreadsheet. So we'll use these values here in order to calculate my final escalation. Okay, so let's go to my final escalation sheet. And now I'm going to apply the formula AF divided by VF times it by V. So this is now certificate number 7, dated on the 25th of August 2018. Now remember my spreadsheet that I've used. Okay, that is the spreadsheet that I've just calculated. If you follow the totals, I can just plug it in. All those totals, I can plug it in my to date. That is the final. And if you look at work group 190, for instance, the 40,000 plus that additional 1,497. There you can also see the final figure for the non-adjustable items. And then previous totals, that's all the totals related to certificate 6 at practical completion. So it's the to date, that's the previous, will give me my total valuation for subject to escalation at this point. Apply the formula, which is now AF divided by VF times it by V. AF, we've already calculated. If you go back to your AF calculation, there's the AF calculation for your contractor, the negative figure for your electrical. So let's just go to the final. That's the AF divided by VF. Now the VF, remember the VF figure is the value that was subject to escalation at practical completion. So this is certificate number 6, and that value there is your VF value. 1.25 million was subject to escalation at practical completion. The V is the outstanding amount at final account stage subject to escalation. So that's your VF figure and your V amount. So if you apply the formula there, that will give you then an amount of 460 Rand, AF divided by VF times V, plus the total amount, accumulated total for certificate number 6, will give me then a final escalation figure of 27,424 Rand and 62 cents. The same applies for your electrical. AF, remember that negative figure. VF, that was the amount at practical completion, subject to escalation. The V is the outstanding amount, subject to escalation. Apply the formula AF divided by V. That gives you a negative figure because of that AF value, which was negative, plus the previous escalation from certificate number 6 up till certificate 6. That will give me then a total escalation value for electrical work of 2,952. So that's the contractor's escalation, and that's the electrical contractor's escalation. So let's just go back to my final summary page. And there you'll see the totals, the main contractor's final escalation and the electrical contractor's final escalation. In my previous examples that was given, in this one, you'll have to determine that. So it's the net figure plus the escalation will give me a subtotal of 1.493 million plus the VAT. So my final contract value is 1.717 and 737 Rand. And then we conclude the final account summary with a statement here that we, that is the contractor and the employer, because they have to sign this in an agreement. If they're happy with it, they will sign it. That they will be happy with the above. It's a true reflection, and there will be no further claims further on once they've signed this specific document. Good, let's go back to my steps. And up till this point, we have now concluded step number 5. And 6. 6 was basically just to, once you finish the calculation of your final escalation, to go back to your final account summary page and then complete that, add the VAT to get to the final contract value. Remember, your bill of quantities is the contract sum, and your final account is then to determine the final contract value. Good. That concludes the part 2 of this discussion. We will then, in the next lecture, discuss step number 7, which relates to the actual issuing of the final payment certificate based on the final account. We'll see each other again.